And now we can move on to the next question. The next question says, which of the following is not characteristic of the demand for commodity that is elastic? A says that the relative change in quantity demanded is greater than the change in price. B says buyers are relatively sensitive to price changes. C says total revenue declines if prices increase. And D says that the elasticity coefficient is less than 1. So let's quickly review. Elasticity of demand is going to be percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. And that's going to be our elasticity coefficient of demand. If we read this to be what elasticity is defined as, we can use that to kind of break down the answers given to us. So A says that the relative change in quantity and demand is greater than relative change in price. And so when we say a commodity is elastic, we say that its elasticity coefficient is greater than 1. And that means that the percent change in quantity demanded must be greater than the percent change in price in order for this to be an elastic good. And so A would be a characteristic of an elastic commodity because it's saying that the change in quantity demand is greater than the change in price. And so that is not going to be a correct answer here. B says that buyers are relatively sensitive to price changes. And so this is also going to be true. What elasticity can be rephrased as is that buyers are basically relatively more sensitive to price changes. When price changes by a certain percentage, the behavior of buyers and the consumption behavior of buyers changes to an even larger degree than a price change would suggest normally. And so that's what we would call elastic, and that's why B is also not going to be the correct answer. C says that total revenue declines if prices increased. And this is also going to be true. If we increase prices when we have an elastic good, we know that we're earning more money per good because prices have gone up. But because of the elastic nature of the good, we're losing a disproportionately high amount of consumer purchases when that price increases, to a point in which those purchases are not, the increase in revenue per good is not offset by a proportional decrease in quantity demanded. And so total revenue goes down when price goes up for an elastic good. And finally, D says the elastic coefficient is less than 1. And we just talked about starting off that the elasticity coefficient for an elastic good is greater than 1. And so D is going to be the correct answer here. Oops. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They said D as well. For commodity that is elastic in demand, elasticity coefficient is greater than 1. Great. Let's take a look at the next question. Suppose the price elasticity demand for bread is 0.2 if the bread falls by 10%. The quantity demanded will increase by A, 2% and total expenditures on bread will rise, B, 2% and total expenditures on bread will fall, C, 20% and total expenditures on bread will fall, or D, 20% and total expenditures on bread will rise. And so a price elasticity of demand for bread being 0.2 means that the percent change in quantity would be 1/5 the proportional change in price. And so if the bread falls, if the price of bread, I'm going to assume that says, if the price of bread falls by 10%, then we would divide 10 by 5 and get 2, or 10 times 0.2 would give us 2%, and there's going to be a 2% increase in quantity demanded because of the given information that we have. And so we know it's not going to be C or D, we know it's going to be either A or B. And the second question is, does total expenditures on bread rise or fall? And by total expenditures, what they really mean is total revenue. And so for an inelastic good, where we have, and we know it's inelastic because our price elasticity is less than 1, it's 0.2. So for an inelastic good, when we decrease the price, we are going to see that total expenditures are going to fall because the decrease in price is not offset by a proportionally high increase in in quantity demanded. We see here that if we're decreasing the price by 10%, we would need there to be a more than 10% increase in quantity demanded for our overall expenditure to rise, because we're losing 10% of the revenue we used to make per good. So we need to have overall number of goods increase by 10% as well. And here we see that for a 10% fall in price, we only see a 2% increase in quantity demanded. And so that does not nearly cover the loss in revenue from the price reduction. And so the correct answer here is going to be B, that the quantity demanded is going to increase by 2% and total expenditures on bread will fall. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. And the previous tutor said A, 2% in total expenditures on bread will rise. And the reasoning is that as quantity changes, in the elasticity, quantity change is given by elasticity times price change, so 2%, and the derivative of expenditure, the change in expenditure is given by Q times 1 minus E, so this 1 minus elasticity. So again, I don't think this is the right rationale. We want to approach this from the total revenue perspective, so we can take a look at that and mark that as incorrect. So for number 2, we would say B. The a elasticity coefficient of 0.2 means that that bread is an inelastic good. When we decrease the price of inelastic good, we see a decrease in total expenditure / revenue. This is because the reduction in price is not offset by a proportional increase in quantity demanded. So that's going to be our rationale for number 2. So let's carry on for number 3. If a consumer is in equilibrium, an increase in money income will A, move him to a new equilibrium on a lower indifference curve, B, make his indifference curve steeper but not alter the equilibrium position. Excuse me. C, have no effect on the equilibrium position because product prices have not changed. Or D, move him to a new equilibrium on a higher indifference curve. So for this question, we're talking about utility and indifference curves. So let's draw that out to get a visual explanation in here. And so we have indifference curves. And so we might see a consumer equilibrium looking something like this. So their equilibrium point is here. They're achieving an optimal indifference curve because the optimal point at equilibrium is where your indifference curve is tangent to your demand curve. And so the question is, what happens when we have an increase in money income? So an increase in money income is going to increase our consumption bundle. And so our budget constraint, sorry. So this isn't a demand curve, I'm sorry. This is a budget constraint, so it's BC1. So higher income means we can afford more of each good. And so we would want to see an expansion of our budget constraints to a higher level. And so it might look like something like this, right? Where we have budget constraint 2 as our new budget constraint, and that's going to increase us from indifference curve 1 to indifference curve 2, which is now tangent to our new budget constraint. So A says that this increase in income will move him to a new equilibrium on a lower indifference curve. And so we can see here very clearly that indifference curve 2 is greater than indifference curve 1, and that's going to be the case in all circumstances. When we increase or expand our budget constraint, we're only going to access higher and higher indifference curves, not lower ones. And so it's not going to be A. B says it's going to make its indifference curve steeper, but it's not alter the equilibrium position. And again, we don't know that's the case. Indifference curves reflect preferences. They don't reflect. They reflect areas. They reflect different bundles in which the consumer would be equally happy to consume. And so, to increase your income only affects your budget constraint. It does not affect the shape of your indifference curve. And so we know it's not going to be B as well. C says that an increase in money income will have no effect on the equilibrium position because product prices have not changed. And so this is incorrect because even if the prices have not changed, by increasing the overall income that the consumer has to work with, that is going to allow the consumer to have greater purchasing power, allowing them to consume more of the goods. So holding price changes equal, we still have an expansion in the budget constraint. And finally, D says that an increase in money income will move him to a new equilibrium on a higher indifferent curve. And so this is going to be exactly what we see occurring in our graph. And so that's going to be the right answer here. So D is going to be correct. And so for 3, we see it says, move him to a new equilibrium on a higher indifference curve. The reason being that an increased income shifts the budget curve upwards, making tangents to higher indifference curves. And that's great. So we're good with that answer. The next question says, the larger the coefficient of price elasticity of demand for a product, the A, larger the resulting price change for an increase in supply, B, more rapid the rate at which the marginal utility of that product diminishes, C says smaller the resulting price change for an increase in supply. So a large coefficient of price elasticity refers to an elastic good, where we say that changes in supply are going to be, changes in demand are going to, changes in quantities demanded are going to be reflected, are going to result from higher, faster changes in, changes in quantity demanded will be greater than the changes in prices that lead to those changes in quantity demanded. And so an elastic graph is going to look like this. An elastic demand curve. Okay, I'm not sure why it's looking like this. Yeah, there we go. So elastic demand curve is going to be much more like shallow in terms of its slope relative to an inelastic demand curve. And so this is what we normally expect to see when we have this type of demand. And so the first question says that the larger resulting price change would be for an increase in supply. And so if this is our supply curve, if supply curve were to go to increase, an inelastic supply curve, an elastic demand curve means that supply changes actually cause relatively smaller price changes compared to in inelastic demand curve. And the reason for that is because of the shallow slope of the demand curve. We see that the price change is just very minor when we shift the supply curve to the right. And so that's not going to be the case. B says more rapid the rate at which the marginal utility of that product diminishes. And again, we know nothing about the marginal utility of the product given the elasticity of demand. We simply know the behavior of consumers when it comes to price changes and quantity changes, so it's not going to be B. And C says the smaller resulting price change for an increase in supply. And so this is going to be correct, that the more elastic a demand curve is, the smaller a price change that is going to occur when supply changes, because demand curve will continue to get flatter and flatter as a result of that elasticity. And so C is going to be the right answer here. The larger a coefficient of price elasticity of demand for a product, the smaller the resulting price change for an increase in supply. And 4 says the larger resulting price change for an increase in supply. And so this talks about, as elasticity indicates price sensitivity to quantity change. If elasticity is more inelastic, then price change is more. So if elasticity is more, then price change is more. So that's not going to be the right answer here, and we're going to write that out for Y. For 4, we see that C is the best answer. A more elastic coefficient of demand means a more flat, means a less and less steep slope for the demand curve overall. When we have a relatively flat demand curve, increases in supply do not reduce price very much compared to an increase in supply with a relatively steep demand curve. As a result, a higher elasticity coefficient of demand means that an increase in supply results in a smaller price change. And so that's going to be our correct answer here. Next question, question number 5 says that a manufacturer of frozen pizza found that total revenue decreased when price was lowered from $5 to $4. It also found that total revenue decreased when price was raised from $5 to $6. Thus, and so we're asked what's going on here. What we're basically seeing is that $5 is probably the optimal point where we have unit elasticity, and so it means that when total revenue is when price is lowered, if total revenue decreases, that implies an inelastic portion of the demand curve below $5. Because the reduction in price is not fully compensated for by an increase in quantity demanded. And so we would know that that would be an inelastic portion of the demand curve. And on the other hand, if total revenue decreased when price was raised, then we know that the price of change from $5 to $6 moves into the elastic portion of the demand curve because the increase in prices was more than offset by a decrease in quantity demanded as a result of higher prices. And so we're left with this kind of sweet spot at $5 where anything below $5 is inelastic, anything above $5 is elastic. And so that's going to match very well with answer choice A, which says that the demand for pizza is elastic above $5 and inelastic below $5. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So the previous tutor says B, the demand for pizza is elastic above and below $5 as derivative of total revenue is equal to quantity times 1 minus E. So if E is greater than 1, then revenue decreases. So both below and above $5 is inelastic. So I'm not really sure where this tutor got this relationship between revenue and elasticity from. And also, if both, even if we were to take this to be true, if E is greater than 1, then it's elastic, right? So I'm not sure why the final answer would be inelastic. And so we're going to rewrite this answer choice to better reflect what's happening here. So B is the right answer. If decreasing the price results in a increase in total revenue, then we know that the the price change is in the inelastic portion of the graph. This is because the decrease in price was not offset by a proportional increase in quantity demanded. On the other hand, if an increase in price results in a decrease in, this is both decrease, in total revenue as well, we know that the price change is in the elastic portion of the graph. This is because the increase in price was more than offset by a disproportionately high decrease in quantity demanded. B, oh sorry, it's A, isn't it? It's not B, it's A. Right, 5 is A, yeah. Therefore, A is the correct answer. Great. Okay, let's take a look at the next question, question 6. The elasticity of demand for a product is likely to be greater, A, if the product is a necessity rather than a luxury, B, the greater amount of time over which the buyers adjust to a price change, or C, the smaller proportion of one. So let's take a little bit, a second to break down these answers. So higher elasticity of demand is going to be an elastic good. So we're saying in which of these cases is price change going to result in a disproportionately high amount of quantity demanded change. So A says if the product is a necessity rather than a luxury. And so when goods are necessities, we would normally expect those goods to have inelastic demands, which are lower elasticity of demands rather than elastic demands. And that's because price changes can't really change the fact that you need these goods. And so even if the price were to increase, you would most likely continue to purchase this good. So A is going to be incorrect because it's talking about inelastic goods rather than elastic goods. B says the greater amount of time over which buyers have to adjust to a price change. And this will make a good more elastic. We talk about this as time frame. And so you can imagine, for example, a change in oil prices. So if oil prices for some reason were to double or triple, in the short run, if the product is really important, then we might not see very much change in quantity demanded. But if we give buyers a lot of time to adapt to this price change, let's say a few years, it's much likely that buyers will shift away from, and gas prices remain that high, it's very likely that consumers will shift away from consumption of gasoline by buying more fuel-efficient cars, buying electric cars, not using cars over entirely. And that means that the reduction in the long term of quantity demand is going to be much higher than it was in the short term. And so B is going to be correct in that if we increase the amount of time buyers have to adjust to a price change, then the elasticity of demand will be higher. And C is a smaller proportion one, and I honestly don't know what that really refers to. But B is the right answer here, so we're going to take a look at what the previous tutor said. And the previous tutor also said B. If the adjustment for time is greater, then the buyers will react more, so elasticity will be greater. And so that's going to be a good answer. And so we're going to mark this solution as incorrect just because we disagreed about 3 of these answer choices, and we can move on to the next set of questions.